Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The clinking of glass and silverware faded into a hush that buzzed just under the surface of polite conversation, like static humming behind the elegance. The country club's main hall smelled of champagne and expensive perfume, a scent that never really lets you relax. Charles stood under soft amber lights with a mic in his hand and that smug, artificial smile plastered across his face, the same one he wore at PTA meetings, funerals, and depositions. He looked like every other self-important executive pushing 70, clean suit, thinner hair, thicker glasses, but to me, he looked like a man who'd been lying his whole life and finally believed the lie himself. The speech had already dragged on for 10 full minutes when I tuned in, somewhere after the golf jokes and before the fake tears. He had thanked the team from the finance department, mentioned how his secretary once saved him from buying a fake Picasso, and even cracked a joke about his cholesterol. Everyone laughed. They always laughed at Charles's jokes, even the ones that weren't funny, especially those. But then he paused. Not the kind of pause you make for effect. No, this was longer. Measured. Sharp. And last, he said, eyes scanning the crowd like he was selecting the perfect target at a shooting range, I want to thank my son, Mason. Wherever he's hiding back there. A few heads turned my way, and I gave a small wave without a smile. I wasn't hiding. I was sitting alone at the table closest to the bar because that's where they put people you don't really want to see but feel obligated to invite. Charles cleared his throat and gripped the mic tighter, like it might fly away if he wasn't careful. Raising you was, without a doubt, the biggest mistake of my life. No one laughed right away. There was a half-second of stunned silence, the kind that makes your skin itch. Then came the awkward chuckles, those nervous little barks people let out when they're not sure if they're supposed to be amused or horrified. A few folks tried to play it off. Oh, he's just kidding. That's Charles being Charles. But I knew better. That wasn't a joke. That was a scalpel. I stood up, pushed in my chair with a slow, deliberate scrape across the polished wooden floor, and started clapping. Not politely. Not sarcastically. Just enough to be heard and remembered. Then I turned around and walked out of that echo chamber of phoniness, straight past the bar, past the host in a red vest pretending not to be mortified, and out into the cool night air. I didn't stop smiling until I got to the parking lot. That moment, those 6 words had been 28 years in the making. My earliest memory of my father wasn't a bedtime story or a piggyback ride. It was the look on his face when I handed him a handmade Father's Day card I'd spent all Saturday morning coloring. I was 10. It had a drawing of us fishing, stick figures, and blue squiggles for water. I handed it to him, all nervous pride, and he looked at it like I'd just smeared shit on his newspaper. "This is cheap trash," he said, barely glancing at it before tossing it on the kitchen counter. "You think this is a gift? You think this counts?" I stood there, heart in my throat, trying to decide whether to cry or nod. I nodded. That seemed safer. Mom tried to say something, but he raised his voice not loud, not angry, just firm enough to freeze the air in the room, and said, "Don't coddle him. Life doesn't coddle you." And that was his parenting style, start to finish. Discipline without warmth. Advice without context. Praise was rationed like wartime sugar, and affection? That was for weak men and desperate women. Charles didn't hug. He shook hands. He offered lectures in place of apologies and believed that suffering built character, as long as it wasn't his own. Back in the parking lot, I lit a cigarette, even though I'd quit a year ago. Old habits sneak back in when old wounds get poked. The smoke tasted like ash and memory. I leaned against the hood of my rental car, black Hyundai, nothing fancy, and looked up at the blinking hotel sign across the street. It said "Welcome Retirees" in plastic letters. Felt like a funeral, not a celebration. I knew he'd try to spin it. I knew he'd say it was a joke, a roast, part of some planned bit to lighten the mood. But even if he begged for forgiveness right there in front of that crowd, it wouldn't matter. Because it wasn't just the words. It was the truth behind them. The truth he had always known and finally dared to say out loud. And the worst part? I wasn't even mad. I felt free. See, when someone finally admits what you've always suspected, when the mask slips and the villain says, "Yeah, I did it and I'd do it again," you don't feel hurt. You feel vindicated. You feel seen. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to guess where I stood with him. I was the mistake. His biggest one. No more pretending. No more hope. But don't get it twisted, this isn't a story about pain. Not anymore. This is a story about clarity. About closure. And about payback, the slow kind, the kind that tastes better cold, because it never gets stale. I opened the driver's side door and sat down, the seat still warm from earlier. I looked at my phone. One missed call. Voicemail waiting. His number. I didn't press play. Not yet. The sunlight leaking through the blinds in my kitchen felt like it was mocking me, too clean, too sharp, too alive for the kind of morning that followed a night like last night. My coffee had gone cold before I even took the first sip, sitting on the chipped countertop next to a half-eaten piece of toast that now tasted like cardboard and regret. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was loaded, like the air right before a storm, or the pause before someone tells you something that can't be taken back. My phone buzzed on the table, sliding a few inches on the varnish with that little hum that always gives me a shot of anxiety. I didn't need to check the screen. I knew who it was. I let it ring the first time, then the second, and by the third, I just sat there, watching it vibrate like a dying insect. The voicemail dinged like a bell tolling in a church I didn't belong to. I tapped it open with a thumb that suddenly felt too heavy, and the first thing I heard was his voice, softer than usual, maybe more tired, definitely older. Not weak, though. He never sounded weak. Even when he was wrong, even when he was crumbling, he held on to that tone like a lifeline. He opened with my name, the way he used to say it when he was trying not to sound angry, but still managed to make it sound like a curse. "Mason, it's your father. I don't want to leave things this way. I know last night wasn't ideal, but I want to see you. I'm not well, and I'd like to fix things while there's still time. I don't want to go with this between us." And that was all I needed to hear. I swiped left and hit delete before he could launch into whatever carefully crafted monologue he had prepared. I didn't want his apology. I didn't want his version of the truth, sanded down and dressed up in a tux like one of his country club toasts. I wanted silence. Because silence, in this case, was control. Silence was the one thing I could give him that he couldn't interrupt, couldn't reframe, couldn't ruin. He missed every major event. My graduation, my scholarship dinner, even my wedding. That's 4 events. Or wait, was it 5? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But one day does stick out. My 12th birthday. I waited all day for him to come home. Mom had made that lemon cake I loved, the one with the frosting that stuck to the roof of your mouth like glue, and she even put those sparkler candles on top, even though she hated how they smelled when they burned. She wore her nice earrings, even though it was just us, because she thought he might actually show up, and she wanted to believe in something that never really existed. But he didn't come. He'd gone fishing with his boss, some weekend trip that was critical for his future, as he explained later that night after stumbling and half-drunk, smelling like lake water and bourbon. He didn't ask what kind of cake we had. He didn't ask about the gifts. He asked why I was still awake, like my existence past 10 p.m. was a personal offense to him. That night, I stopped expecting birthdays to feel like anything other than reminders. And I remember standing at the podium at my college graduation, reading the speech they said was the best they'd heard in years, looking out over a sea of parents and siblings and friends. I looked for his face. Just once. One glance. But he wasn't there. He'd sent me a watch in the mail 2 days later with a card that said, "Punctuality matters. Congratulations." I pawned the watch that afternoon. It wasn't just the big moments he missed. It was the small ones that built the walls between us, one brick at a time. The basketball game where I scored 12 points and he told me I dribbled like I had something up my ass. The day I got accepted into Stanford, and he asked how much debt that was going to put him in. The afternoon I told him I got promoted to editor, and he asked why I hadn't been named publisher yet. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and I bled in silence because I thought maybe someday it would be enough to matter. But last night proved it never would be. I could have been the president of the goddamn United States, and he'd still say I held the pen wrong. I walked to the drawer under the microwave, the one I never opened unless I was looking for something I didn't want to find, and I pulled out the envelope. It was yellowing, sealed with 2 pieces of Scotch tape, and on the front, in my mother's delicate script, it read, "Do not open until he dies." My hands shook a little, not because I was nervous, but because this was the first time in 20 years that I'd felt like my mom was still in the room, like maybe she left me something I didn't even know I needed. The weight of the envelope felt heavier than paper should ever feel, and I didn't open it. Not yet. But I held it like a secret that was ready to be loud. I placed it on the kitchen table beside my cold coffee, beside the phone that buzzed again with another call I wouldn't answer, and I stared at it like it might blink or breathe or say my name. Let him keep calling. Let him keep begging. I had all the time in the world now. And he was running out. The rain outside tapped on the window pane like it had something urgent to say but couldn't quite form the words, just a persistent rhythm against glass, while the sky sank lower and the whole city seemed to exhale into a fog. My apartment had that kind of quiet only storms bring, thick, still, dense with memory, and the dim glow from the kitchen light barely cut through the gray as I sat at the table where I'd left the envelope the night before. It hadn't moved, hadn't screamed, hadn't opened itself, and yet it felt like it had been burning a hole in the air around it for hours. I hadn't slept. I'd just stared at the ceiling, listened to the rain, and waited for whatever was inside that envelope to change everything I thought I knew. When I finally peeled back the brittle tape, it made a sound like skin being torn. Inside, there wasn't much. A small brass key, cool to the touch, wrapped in a piece of floral stationery that smelled faintly of old perfume, my mother's perfume. She'd been gone nearly 20 years, but for a second, just one fragile second, I could almost hear her humming in the kitchen, that same goddamn Stevie Nicks song she used to play while washing dishes. The paper was folded in thirds, crisp from time, ink slightly faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant, precise, soft, but never unsure. He wasn't always like this, but you need to know the truth about the accident. That was all it said. No signature. No explanation. Just that sentence, dangling in the air like a blade balanced on a thread. I read it again, and then a third time, but it didn't grow any clearer. It didn't comfort or enlighten. It just widened the space between the truth I thought I understood and the truth I now suspected had been buried with her. I turned the key over in my hand and felt its jagged teeth, cold and slightly rusted, like it had waited a long time to be useful. The accident. That's what everyone always called it, the accident. Like the word alone was supposed to clean the blood off it. It happened on a Thursday night in late November, and I remember every second of that day with the kind of clarity that should be reserved for miracles, not tragedy. I was 16. My mom had been quiet all afternoon, the way she got when things had gone sideways with my father. She'd made spaghetti for dinner, but barely touched it, and when he came home, later than usual, smelling like smoke and someone else's perfume, they went into their bedroom and closed the door. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Something about done pretending, something about you always twist it, something about he's not afraid of you anymore. There was a crash, a drawer slammed, and then she stormed out of the room holding her purse and keys, face pale but eyes burning. He followed her to the front door and said something I couldn't make out, but she turned around and replied with a voice that didn't even sound like hers, "I'll go alone. You've done enough already." That was the last time I saw her alive. She died 40 miles away, wrapped around a tree off Highway 12, rain-soaked road and bald tires, making sure she never got the chance to come back. They said it was an accident. They said it was tragic. But nobody ever said it was strange that she'd driven into a storm that thick, with no jacket, no clear destination, and no one beside her to stop her from sliding into the dark. Until now. Because this note, this short, quiet dagger of a message, suggested there was something more behind that night than just bad weather and bad luck. My mother had never been the type to write in riddles. She didn't believe in them. She believed in getting to the point. And if she wrote that I needed to know the truth, then it meant there was something very specific she had kept from me, something she hadn't dared say aloud when he was alive. The key didn't match anything in the apartment, and it wasn't for a house door. I knew that right away. It was heavier, more industrial. I turned it over again and noticed a tiny number etched into the base, 1847. Not a house number. Not a locker. It looked like a safety deposit key. I sat back in the chair and stared at the note like it might rearrange itself and give me more answers. But it didn't. It just sat there, perfectly still, heavy with everything it didn't say. A few hours later, I was standing in front of the only bank my parents had ever used, holding the key like it might bite me. I didn't know what I'd find inside that box, if it would be something that broke me, something that proved my father was worse than I ever imagined, or maybe something that would force me to question everything I'd built my hatred on. But I knew one thing, and I knew it without a doubt. Whatever was in that safety deposit box wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes but mine. And I was finally ready to see it. The vault smelled like metal and cold paper, that sterile scent that clings to government buildings, hospital corridors, and secrets that have been sealed too long. A security guard in a blue blazer buzzed me through two heavy steel doors before leading me into a silent corridor lined with numbered boxes like crypts waiting to be opened. I handed over the key 1847 and signed a form that I didn't bother reading because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the pen straight. The guard didn't ask questions, just nodded like he'd seen men like me before, quiet, pale, holding back something they'd carried for too long. When he left me alone in the small gray room, I sat down in the hard chair next to the table bolted to the floor and stared at the narrow box resting there like it might start whispering. The lock clicked open with one twist, the metal screeching like it hadn't moved in decades. And then I saw it, 3 objects, nothing more, all resting in silence like artifacts from a life I thought I'd already understood. The first thing I noticed was the stack of photos bound together with a rubber band so dry it snapped when I pulled it off. Most were old, black and white, some faded color, images of my parents before I was born. My mother, smiling under a willow tree, wearing a sundress I'd never seen, her eyes soft, but her smile unsure. My father next to her, leaning close, his hand on her lower back, looking more like a stranger than the man who raised me. And then, later, photos of me as a baby, a toddler, a boy. But these weren't the usual kind you'd put in an album. These were candid, sometimes grainy, often off-center, like someone was documenting us from a distance. In one, I was maybe 6 years old, sitting on the steps in our backyard, looking down at a paper in my lap. My mother stood behind me with a hand on my shoulder, but Charles wasn't in the frame. A chill ran down my back as I realized something: these weren't taken by her. Next was the burner phone, cheap, plastic, gray with dust. No charger. Just the phone, powered off. I set it aside, unsure why it had been left here or what it might contain. But it was the third item that pulled the air out of the room. A letter, folded neatly, addressed to me, in his handwriting. I sat with it in my lap for a long moment before unfolding it, my fingers numb even as I forced myself to read the first line. Mason, if you're reading this, then I'm probably dead, or at least too far gone to say what I should have told you while I was still able. I nearly stopped right there. But I didn't. The letter wasn't long, but it wasn't short either. It was dense, ugly, unfiltered in a way that felt like a man who knew there were no consequences left. He confessed to cheating on my mother repeatedly over the years, sometimes with women from work, sometimes with strangers, sometimes with women she knew. He admitted that she found out more than once, and every time she threatened to leave, he found new ways to keep her. Not through violence, at least not in the way most people think, but through words, silence, pressure, and control. Emotional sabotage, the kind of slow erosion that doesn't show up in bruises, but leaves scars all the same. I didn't hit her, the letter said. I just broke her so she wouldn't go. He detailed how he'd convinced her she had nowhere to go, that no one would believe her, that she'd be throwing away her son's stability. He knew exactly what to say to make her doubt herself. And when she finally decided she was done on that rainy Thursday night, he made sure she left alone, terrified, already halfway to unraveling. Then he turned the knife. I didn't hate you, Mason. I envied you. That line hit harder than anything else. He envied me. Not because of what I'd accomplished, but because of who I was, who I could have been without him dragging me down. He envied my softness, my hope, my need to be better. And instead of supporting that, he tried to kill it. He even confessed to the one story I never told anyone but my mother. When I was 14, I won a statewide writing contest. I wrote a short story about grief, about what it meant to feel invisible inside your own house. My mother cried when she read it. She called it beautiful. I never heard what my father thought until now. Apparently, he read it, tore it apart word by word, and told me it was sentimental garbage because he didn't want me getting ideas above my place. And then he mailed it. Under his own name. And it got published in some middlebrow lit mag he used to read in his study. He didn't even keep the clipping. Just wanted to prove he could take what was mine and make it his. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, and placed it back in the box like it might stain the air around me if I left it out any longer. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just felt quiet. Then I picked it up again, stood, and walked it over to the trash can in the corner of the vault. And I dropped it in like it was nothing more than the wrapper off a bad memory. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I took the burner phone. Because if that man had left me something I hadn't yet seen, if there were voicemails or messages or numbers in that cheap little brick of plastic, I wanted to know what else he had hidden. And this time, I wouldn't be deleting anything. The sky was still half asleep when I reached the top of the hill, the kind of dim early morning light that doesn't make any promises, just floats above the earth like a thin layer of indifference. The cemetery below stretched out in neat rows of stone and grass, names carved deep into granite, each one holding a story someone either couldn't finish or never got around to telling. The air had that crisp stillness you only find in places where the living don't outnumber the dead. I didn't come here for closure because I never really believed in that. I came for the same reason you go back to the place you got hurt, to make sure the wound finally stopped bleeding. Charles had already been buried a few days, maybe a week. I hadn't asked for the exact date. My cousin emailed me the obituary, short and formal, the way men like him wanted to be remembered, respected, dedicated, pillar of his profession, the kind of words you use when no one dares say what they really think. I didn't go to the service. I didn't send flowers. I didn't even open the sympathy cards that trickled into my mailbox like apologies I didn't ask for. I waited until everyone else had their moment, their final words, their polite, tear-choked goodbyes. Then I walked out here alone, the same way he made her walk out into that storm all those years ago. The burner phone buzzed in my coat pocket just as I stopped in front of his headstone. I hadn't turned it on since the day I took it from the safety deposit box. It only had one contact saved, under the name Dad, like some cruel joke. I opened the voicemail icon, and sure enough, there it was, new message, left a few weeks ago, right around the time I imagine he realized I'd opened the letter. I know you found the letter. I know what I did. I don't deserve peace, but maybe you do. Please, just give me something. That was all he said. The words dragged like they were stuck to his tongue, like even his guilt had trouble making it out of his mouth. There was no apology, not really. Just that request, that last pathetic grab for redemption, as if he could trade his confession for my forgiveness, like one of those shitty chess games he used to play, where he'd sacrifice a pawn just to feel clever. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, his voice already fading into the air, and I realized something that landed in my chest like a stone dropped in water. For years I had wanted him to say those words. For years I had dreamed of hearing him admit he was wrong, even just once. But now that I had them, now that they existed, I didn't feel anything close to what I thought I would. Not relief. Not power. Just the dull throb of old anger that had calcified into something worse, indifference. So I called the number back. It rang once. Twice. Then straight to voicemail. I didn't speak. I didn't clear my throat or make a sound. I just held the phone to my ear, 5 full minutes of silence, letting the static stretch between us like a rope I was finally ready to cut. I gave him exactly what he gave me in every moment that counted. Nothing. No explanation. No kindness. No warmth. And in that stillness, in those 5 long minutes, I thought about the night when I was 9 years old, sitting at the dinner table, tears slipping down my cheeks because I'd spilled my milk in front of the guests. Charles had chuckled, the kind of low chuckle that carried over the sound of silverware clinking against china, and said, "Don't mind him. He's a little soft. I'm raising a weakling, but at least he doesn't talk too much." Everyone laughed. I remember that. They laughed like it was harmless, like I wouldn't remember it years later with every new betrayal, every quiet humiliation, every goddamn time I second-guessed whether I was ever enough. And the worst part wasn't that he said it. The worst part was that I didn't say a word back. I just sat there, mouth full of silence and shame, trying not to cry harder. Now, decades later, I was finally finishing that moment. Finally giving him a silence that wasn't weak but sharpened by time, shaped by all the things I never said. The voicemail recording ended. I hung up. I stared down at the grave, at the name etched in stone like it had any right to permanence. I pressed delete. He wanted a response. So I gave him exactly what he gave me for 35 years, fucking nothing. I turned and walked back down the hill, hands in my coat pockets, the cold wind curling around my ears like whispers I refused to hear. The sun was just starting to crack over the horizon, casting long shadows over the grass, turning everything gold and gray at once. I didn't feel peace. I didn't feel closure. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was silence. The kind that doesn't ask for answers. And maybe, just maybe, that's all I ever really needed.